Some chains are forged not by iron, but by the choices we refuse to make. Deep in the Carpathian Mountains, where ancient stones hold secrets older than memory, Castle Draculesti rises from the mist like a monument to forgotten sins. For 8 years, no servant has lasted more than 90 days within its walls. Most flee screaming into the night, driven mad by their master's cruelty, while others simply vanish without explanation. The locals whisper that Lord Valerian Draculesti doesn't just drain blood, he feeds on despair itself, breaking minds before breaking necks. But Mira Thorne isn't like the others. The blacksmith's daughter arrived 3 months ago with calloused hands, steel in her spine, and something the Vampire King has never encountered, complete immunity to his psychic manipulation. While others cowered, she met his crimson gaze with unflinching defiance. While others begged, she spoke back with sharp words that cut deeper than any blade. Now, as winter's fury traps them together in the Gothic fortress, an impossible question emerges: what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? And why does this mysterious girl carry the scent of magic that died 3 centuries ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hook. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed midnight, its bronze voice echoing through corridors that had witnessed too much death. Mira Thorne paused in her scrubbing, brush suspended over the bloodstain that had appeared on the marble floor 3 nights ago, the same spot where the previous servant had been found, throat torn open, eyes wide with terror. She'd grown accustomed to the stains. They appeared with clockwork regularity, usually after Lord Draculesti's midnight hunts in the village below. What she hadn't grown accustomed to was the way her skin prickled whenever she felt his presence, the way shadows seemed to bend toward him as if drawn by some unholy magnetism. "Still scrubbing, little dove?" The voice materialized from the darkness behind her, silk smooth and dangerous as winter ice. Mira didn't flinch, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She'd learned that showing fear only encouraged him. "Someone has to," she replied, not bothering to look up from her work. "Blood doesn't clean itself." Lord Valerian Draculesti stepped into the flickering candlelight, and even after 3 months, the sight of him struck her like a physical blow. He was beautiful in the way that storms were beautiful, terrible and magnificent and utterly destructive. Pale skin stretched over aristocratic bones, dark hair that caught light like spilled ink, and those eyes, crimson as fresh blood, ancient as the mountains themselves. "Most servants would weep at the sight," he observed, circling her with predatory grace. "Or flee." The last one lasted precisely 4 days before she threw herself from the tower window, rather than face another night in my presence. Mira's brush never paused in its steady rhythm. "Then you should choose servants with stronger stomachs." A sound escaped him, half laugh, half snarl. In the 3 months since she'd arrived, responding to his newspaper advertisement out of sheer desperation, no servant had ever spoken to him with such casual insolence. Most couldn't even meet his gaze without falling under his thrall, their minds turning to malleable clay beneath the weight of his psychic influence. But not this one. Never this one. "Look at me, Mira." It wasn't a request. The command rippled through the air with supernatural force, the same power that had brought kings to their knees and sent armies fleeing in terror. She should have obeyed instantly, helplessly, her will dissolved like sugar in rain. Instead, she sat back on her heels and fixed him with a steady stare that held neither fear nor submission. "I'm looking," she said simply. Valerian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For 800 years, his compulsion had never failed. He could reach into minds like opening books, rewrite thoughts with the ease of editing text. Yet this slip of a girl, this blacksmith's daughter with her rough hands and defiant spirit, remained utterly untouchable. "Why don't you break?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Raw and frustrated, Mira tilted her head, studying his face with unsettling directness. "Perhaps because I was already broken before I came here." She spoke the truth without self-pity, matter-of-fact as discussing the weather. The death of her father had taken everything, their smithy, their home, her last coin spent on his burial. When she'd seen the advertisement for a servant position at Castle Draculesti, the generous wages had outweighed the whispered warnings about previous servants disappearing. What the villagers didn't know was that she'd been hearing whispers all her life, not from people but from metal itself. Iron sang to her in ways she'd never understood, called to her blood like greeting old friends. Her father had dismissed it as imagination, but Mira knew better. Something in her bloodline ran deeper than ordinary flesh and bone. "Tell me," Valerian said, moving closer until she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. "What dreams visit you in the darkness?" It was another probe, another attempt to slip past her mental defenses. She felt it slide off her consciousness like water off stone. "The same dreams that have haunted me since childhood," she replied, returning to her scrubbing. "Fire and shadow, and a woman's voice calling my name across centuries." Valerian went very still. "What name does she call?" "Mine, always mine." Mira glanced up, catching something flicker across his perfect features. Recognition, fear. "Why? Do you know something about dreams, my lord?" For a moment, she thought he might answer. His crimson eyes searched her face with desperate intensity, as if looking for someone else entirely. Then the moment passed, and his expression shuttered closed. "Finish your work," he said, already melting back into shadow, "and avoid the east wing tonight. I'm entertaining." As his footsteps faded into silence, Mira returned to scrubbing the bloodstain. But her hands trembled slightly now, not from fear but from something deeper. A recognition she couldn't quite name, as if she'd been having this conversation her entire life. In the distance, a woman began screaming. Mira didn't stop scrubbing. In Castle Draculesti, screaming was just another kind of music, and she was learning to dance to its rhythm. The screaming lasted 14 minutes. Mira counted each one as she worked, her brush moving in steady circles against the marble. She'd learned to measure Lord Draculesti's entertainments by their duration. The longer they lasted, the more restless he became in the following days. 14 minutes suggested tonight's victim had possessed unusual resilience, which meant tomorrow would bring fresh flowers to arrange and new bloodstains to scrub. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. She finished cleaning and gathered her supplies, moving through corridors that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Shadows danced in her peripheral vision, but she'd stopped turning to look weeks ago. The castle was full of phantoms, some real, some imagined, all hungry. Her chambers were in the servants' wing, a Spartan room with a narrow bed and a window that faced the village far below. During her first week, she'd watched the lights winking out one by one as families barricaded themselves behind iron-bound doors and salt circles. Now she barely glanced outside. The view only reminded her how isolated she truly was. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories. Always the same sequence: fire consuming ancient stones, shadows writhing with purpose, and that voice, melodious and terrible, calling her name with increasing desperation. She would wake with the taste of smoke on her tongue and words in a language she didn't recognize burning behind her teeth. Dawn brought no relief, only routine. Mira rose before sunrise, as she had every morning for the past 3 months. The castle demanded constant attention, floors to scrub, silver to polish, rooms to air despite their occupants' absence during daylight hours. She'd inherited the duties of 12 servants, each predecessor having fled, vanished or died in increasingly creative ways. The work suited her. Physical labor had always been her comfort, learned at her father's forge where she'd spent countless hours pumping bellows and sorting iron. Her hands, scarred from years of handling hot metal, were steady as she dusted ancient portraits whose subjects seemed to follow her movement with painted eyes. In the kitchen, she prepared meals she would eat alone. Lord Draculesti required no sustenance save what he took from living veins, though he sometimes appeared to watch her eat, with fascination, as if observing some exotic ritual. She'd learned to ignore his presence during these moments, though her skin always prickled when those crimson eyes fixed upon her. The loneliness should have driven her mad by now. 3 months without meaningful human contact, without laughter or warmth or simple conversation, unmarked by supernatural menace. She wrote letters to no one. There was no one left to write to. Her father's death had severed her last earthly connection, leaving her adrift in ways that had nothing to do with geography. Yet something kept her anchored here, beyond mere financial necessity. It was the dreams, she realized as she polished a mirror that reflected rooms she'd never seen. Each night brought clearer visions, stronger whispers. The woman's voice grew more distinct, more familiar, as if approaching across a vast distance. Sometimes Mira caught herself listening for it during her waking hours, straining to hear those phantom calls over the castle's oppressive silence. "You're thinking too loudly." She spun, nearly dropping the mirror. Lord Draculesti stood in the doorway, though sunset was still hours away. Shadows clung to him like living things, providing sanctuary from the dim afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains. "I thought you slept during the day," she said, masking her surprise behind practiced composure. "Sleep is a luxury I rarely indulge," his gaze fixed on the mirror in her hands. "Tell me, what do you see when you look into reflective surfaces?" Another test, another probe. She was growing weary of them, these constant attempts to map the boundaries of her strangeness. "My own face," she replied flatly. "Though lately, I wonder if it's truly mine." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of the same desperate intensity she'd glimpsed the night before. "What do you mean?" Mira hesitated. She'd never spoken these thoughts aloud, had barely acknowledged them to herself. But isolation bred honesty, and Lord Draculesti's presence seemed to draw confessions from her like venom from a wound. "Sometimes I feel like I'm wearing someone else's skin," she admitted, "living someone else's life, as if the real me is still sleeping, and this is all an elaborate dream. And if you could wake up?" His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "If you could reclaim that other life, would you?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications she couldn't decipher. In the mirror's surface, their reflections stood frozen, her dark hair and determined jaw, his otherworldly beauty and ageless sorrow. "I don't know," she said finally. "I'm not even sure I'd recognize it." Lord Draculesti stepped closer, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her reflection and the growing certainty that her ordinary world was already gone, had perhaps never existed at all. Mira stood frozen in the afternoon shadows, clutching the mirror against her chest as Lord Draculesti's footsteps faded into the castle's depths. The weight of his unasked questions lingered in the air like incense, and she found herself staring at her reflection with new uncertainty. The face looking back at her seemed familiar, yet strange, as if she were viewing herself through water. A sound broke the silence, not the usual groaning of ancient timber or whisper of wind through stone, but something entirely foreign to the castle's vocabulary of despair. Horses, multiple horses, their hooves striking the cobblestones of the courtyard below with purposeful rhythm. Mira moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. Through the perpetual mist that shrouded the mountains, she could make out a procession of riders ascending the winding path to the castle gates. Black horses bearing figures in dark travelling cloaks, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. At their head rode a woman whose posture suggested nobility, her mount stepping with the confidence of one accustomed to deference. Visitors. In 3 months, no one had dared approach Castle Draculesti except the occasional terrified villager bringing tribute or desperate pleas for mercy. Yet these riders showed no hesitation, no fear, only grim determination as they drew closer to the massive iron gates. The woman in the lead raised her hand, and Mira caught a glimpse of pale fingers adorned with silver rings that caught the dying light. Something about the gesture sent ice through her veins, though she couldn't say why. It was familiar in the way nightmares were familiar, recognized without being understood. Heavy bells began tolling in the castle's towers, a sound Mira had never heard before. The bronze voices rang out in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic, announcing arrivals of significance rather than mere guests. Lord Draculesti materialized in the corridor behind her so suddenly that she gasped, his presence like a cold wind against her back. "Step away from the window," he commanded. And for the first time since she had known him, his voice carried genuine urgency rather than casual menace. But Mira remained transfixed by the scene below. The lead rider had dismounted and stood before the gates with supernatural stillness, her hood now fallen back to reveal silver hair that gleamed like moonlight. Even at this distance, Mira could feel the woman's gaze sweep upward, searching the castle's windows with predatory intent. "They've found me," Lord Draculesti murmured, and the words carried centuries of weariness. "After all these years, they've finally found me." "Who are they?" Mira asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. "The Coven of the Silver Moon, witches whose bloodlines stretch back to the first days of magic, when the boundary between worlds was thin as silk." His reflection appeared beside hers in the window glass, crimson eyes fixed on the riders below. "They've come for you, Mira." The words hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible. I'm no one. I'm just a blacksmith's daughter who speaks to iron and resists vampiric compulsion." His laugh held no humor. "A girl who dreams in ancient languages and sees faces in mirrors that aren't her own? You are never ordinary, little dove. The only question is whether you're ready to discover what you truly are." Below, the silver-haired woman raised her hand toward the castle, and Mira felt something stir deep in her chest. A recognition that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to her bones. The sensation was like hearing her own name called across a vast distance, familiar and terrifying in equal measure. "The dreams," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "They're not dreams at all, are they?" "Memories," Lord Draculesti confirmed, his voice soft as death. "Lives lived and lost, power inherited and abandoned. You are the daughter of a bloodline that once ruled over life and death itself, and they've come to reclaim what they believe belongs to them." The gates began to swing open with the grinding protest of unused hinges. The riders urged their horses forward into the courtyard, and Mira could hear their voices now, chanting in harmony, words that seemed to resonate in her very marrow. The sound called to something sleeping deep within her, something that stirred and stretched, like a creature waking from hibernation. "I have to choose, don't I?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Go with them, or stay here with a monster who has done unspeakable things in pursuit of a salvation that may not exist." Lord Draculesti's reflection smiled, but it was edged with something that might have been pain. "They will offer you truth, Mira, purpose, the chance to reclaim a legacy that spans centuries. And if I stay, then we discover together whether some curses can be broken or whether we're both doomed to repeat the sins of the past." The chanting grew louder, closer, and Mira could feel her ordinary world cracking like ice in spring. Whatever choice she made in the next few moments would shatter the fragile existence she'd built within these cursed walls. The silver-haired woman's voice rose above the others, calling out a single word that echoed through the castle like a summoning bell. "Seraphina." Mira's breath caught. Somehow, impossibly, she knew that name was meant for her. The name hung in the air like a blade suspended over her throat. Seraphina. It resonated in her bones with the weight of absolute truth, as if she'd been wearing the wrong name her entire life like an ill-fitting dress. Mira pressed her palms against the cold window glass, her breath fogging the surface as panic clawed at her chest. "That's not my name," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she felt their falseness. The syllables of Seraphina rolled through her mind with devastating familiarity, unlocking chambers of memory she hadn't known existed. "Isn't it?" Lord Draculesti stepped closer, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. "Tell me truthfully, when she spoke that name, what did you feel?" The answer terrified her more than any supernatural threat she'd faced in 3 months of serving a vampire. Recognition, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Like coming home. The chanting below grew stronger, more insistent, and Mira could feel it tugging at something deep within her core. Each harmonious note seemed to unravel another thread of the life she'd believed was hers. The forge where she'd worked beside her father, the village where she'd grown up, even her own memories, all had felt suddenly thin and insubstantial, like paint beginning to peel from an ancient wall. "They're calling to your true self," Lord Draculesti said softly. "The power that should have been yours from birth. Think of what you could become, Mira. No more scrubbing blood from floors or living in the shadow of monsters. You could reclaim your birthright, command magic that could reshape the very foundations of the world." His words painted seductive pictures in her mind, herself standing before ancient altars, channeling forces that could bend reality to her will, finally understanding the whispers that had followed her since childhood. The iron that sang to her blood would reveal its secrets. The dreams that haunted her sleep would transform into memories of power and purpose. But with the allure came terror so profound it nearly drove her to her knees. What if I'm not strong enough? The question escaped her in a rush. What if I'm meant for something I can't handle? I've spent my entire life being ordinary, being safe. This... She gestured toward the window where the chanting continued its relentless pull. "This feels like stepping off a cliff with no certainty there's ground below." The weight of potential destiny pressed down on her like a physical force. To Serafina, to embrace whatever legacy that name carried, meant abandoning every comfortable lie she'd ever told herself about who she was. It meant accepting that her father might not have been her father, that her life in the village might have been an elaborate fiction, that the quiet existence she'd cherished was nothing more than borrowed time. "And if they're wrong," she continued, her voice growing desperate. "What if I follow them and discover I'm just disappointment wearing the face of someone important? What if whatever power they think I possess died with whoever I was supposed to be?" Lord Draculesti was silent for a long moment, studying her reflection with those ancient crimson eyes. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of centuries. "Then you'll have traded one kind of prison for another," he said. "But at least you'll know the truth of what you are, rather than spending eternity wondering what you might have been." The chanting below shifted, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Mira could hear individual voices now, women calling to her in languages that predated memory, promising power and knowledge and belonging. The silver-haired woman's voice rose above the rest, speaking words that bypassed Mira's conscious mind and spoke directly to her soul. Yet something held her frozen at the window, unable to move toward either escape or surrender. It was Lord Draculesti himself, she realized with dawning horror. Not his supernatural influence, that had never worked on her, but something far more dangerous. In 3 months of isolation, of existing in the spaces between his cruelties and his strange, desperate questioning, she had begun to matter to him. And despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, he had begun to matter to her. "You're afraid too," she whispered, turning from the window to face him directly. "You're afraid of what happens if I go with them." His perfect mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. "I have been alone for 800 years, he said quietly. "The prospect of returning to that solitude is daunting." The admission hung between them like a confession in a cathedral, sacred and terrible and utterly honest. In that moment, Mira understood that her choice wasn't simply between safety and power, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. It was between the unknown promise of what she might become and the fragile, impossible connection she'd forged with a monster in the darkness. The chanting grew louder still, and somewhere in the castle's depths, footsteps began approaching, measured, deliberate, inevitable. Time was running out, and she still had no idea which choice might save her, or which might damn them all. The footsteps grew closer, echoing through the castle's ancient corridors, with the inevitability of fate itself. Mira stood transfixed between the window and Lord Draculesti's desperate gaze, feeling the weight of 8 centuries of solitude pressing against her consciousness. The chanting below had become a symphony of summoning, each note threading through her bones like silver wire, pulling her toward a destiny she'd never chosen. "I can't," she whispered. But even as the words formed, she knew they were a lie. She could feel something awakening inside her, not just recognition of the name Serafina, but acknowledgement of everything that came with it, the power humming beneath her skin, the memories clawing at the edges of her awareness, the truth that had been buried under 23 years of carefully constructed normalcy. Lord Draculesti stepped closer, and she could see her own turmoil reflected in his crimson eyes. "If you stay," he said softly, "I cannot promise you safety. I cannot promise you anything except questions that may never have answers. And if I go with them, then you become something I could never protect you from, something I might have to destroy." The admission hung between them like a blade, sharp with honesty and terrible with implication. Mira understood then that her choice would damn one of them, perhaps both. Heavy doors creaked open somewhere below, and the chanting shifted, becoming more personal, more intimate. She could hear her name, both names, being called with increasing urgency. Mira, Serafina, child of shadow and flame, daughter of forgotten bloodlines, come home. "They're inside," she breathed. "Yes." Lord Draculesti's voice held centuries of resignation, "and they will not leave without what they came for." The temperature in the room began to drop, and Mira could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Frost spread across the window glass in patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that tugged at her memory with painful familiarity. The iron in her blood sang a discordant song, and for a moment she swayed under the weight of visions that weren't quite dreams and weren't quite memories. A woman with silver hair standing before a great fire, hands raised in supplication or command. Ancient stones drinking blood like wine. And herself, Serafina, young and terrible and beautiful, wielding power that could remake the world or destroy it utterly. "I remember," she gasped, pressing her hands to her temples as the visions intensified. "Not everything, but pieces. God help me. I remember cursing you." Lord Draculesti went very still. "Do you remember why?" Images flashed through her mind like lightning, betrayal and blood, love twisted into something monstrous, choices that had damned them both to centuries of suffering. She saw herself as she had been, proud and powerful, and ultimately fatally naive. "Because I loved you," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "And because you chose darkness over everything we could have been together." The footsteps in the corridor stopped directly outside their door. The silver-haired woman's voice carried through the ancient wood, warm and compelling and absolutely merciless. "Serafina, child of my bloodline, your time of hiding is over. Come to us willingly, or we will drag you from this cursed place and burn it to ash around your monster." Mira looked at Lord Draculesti. Valerian, she remembered now, his true name rising from the depths of recovered memory, and saw 800 years of longing and regret written across his perfect features. "The curse," she said suddenly. "You've been searching for someone who could break it. Someone who could remember enough to undo what was done." "Yes. It has to be willing," she continued, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "Forgiveness freely given by the one who cast it in the first place. Yes." The door began to creak open, ancient hinges protesting as supernatural force pressed against it. Golden light spilled through the widening crack, carrying with it the scent of burning herbs and old magic. Mira straightened, feeling power unfold within her like wings she'd forgotten she possessed. The ordinary girl who had scrubbed floors and polished silver was dissolving like morning mist, revealing something far older and infinitely more dangerous beneath. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the very stones of the castle tremble. "I choose neither," she declared, and the door slammed shut with enough force to shake dust from the rafters. "I am Serafina of the Silver Moon, and I choose my own path." The chanting below faltered, then stopped entirely. In the sudden silence, Mira, Seraphina, turned to face the vampire who had once been her lover and her greatest mistake. "If you want forgiveness," she said, power crackling around her like a visible storm, "you'll have to earn it. But I won't run from what I am any longer." The silence that followed her declaration stretched like a held breath before shattering into chaos. The door exploded inward with enough force to splinter the ancient oak, and the silver-haired woman stepped through, wreathed in golden fire that cast dancing shadows across the stone walls. "Foolish child," she said, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. "You think you can defy the coven with parlor tricks and half-remembered power?" But Seraphina, no longer Mira, perhaps never truly Mira, stood her ground as energy crackled between her fingers like captured lightning. "I think I can make my own choices, grandmother." The word escaped before conscious thought, pulled from the depths of awakening memory. The silver-haired woman's eyes widened fractionally, the first crack in her imperious composure. "You do remember me, Lirale?" The name rolled off her tongue like a caress and a threat combined. "Though you were barely more than a babe when you let me be hidden away to keep me safe from my own power," Seraphina finished, fragments of memory crystallizing into painful clarity. "When you decided I was too dangerous to train properly, too volatile to trust with the truth." Behind the woman, Lirale, High Priestess of the Silver Moon, 3 other witches filed into the room. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but Seraphina could feel their power pressing against her awakening abilities like competing storms. The temperature dropped another degree, and ice began forming along the edges of the windows. "You were a child playing with forces that could unmake reality itself," Lirale snapped, golden flames dancing higher around her form. "Look what your untrained magic accomplished. 800 years of curse and suffering, all because you couldn't control your temper." Valerian moved closer to Seraphina's side, his own supernatural aura rising to meet the witch's power. The air between them shimmered with barely contained violence. "She was betrayed," he said quietly, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "By me and by those who should have protected her. Whatever she did, whatever darkness she unleashed, I earned every moment of it." One of the hooded figures laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "The monster defends his captor. How touching. Tell me, vampire, how many innocents have you drained while nursing your guilt? How many lives have you taken in your desperate search for absolution?" Valerian's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny the accusation. Seraphina felt something twist in her chest, not quite the old love, but not entirely free of it either. The man she had cursed was gone, she realized, worn away by centuries of seeking redemption for sins that multiplied with each passing year. "Enough," she said, stepping between them before the confrontation could escalate further. "You want me to come with you? Fine. But first I need to understand what I am, what I was, and what you expect me to become." "What you are," Lirale said with grim satisfaction, "is the last heir to the bloodline of the first moon. Your power, properly trained, could reshape the supernatural world. Wars have been fought for lesser prizes. And what I was, a foolish girl who believed love could redeem monsters." Lirale's gaze flicked dismissively toward Valerian. "You learned better, eventually." The memories were coming faster now, flooding through Seraphina's consciousness like water through a broken dam. She saw herself as she had been, 17 and radiant with untapped power, believing she could save everyone, heal everything, love away the darkness that had begun to consume the man who had sworn to protect her people. "I tried to bind him," she whispered, understanding blooming like a poisonous flower. "I tried to tie his soul to mine, to force him to feel what I felt, to make the humanity he was losing permanent. And instead you created something worse than death," one of the hooded figures said. "A curse that feeds on suffering, that grows stronger with every life he takes. You didn't save him. You damned him to an existence where redemption becomes more impossible with each passing day." Valerian made a sound that might have been pain or agreement, She was trying to help, he said softly. She couldn't have known. She should have known, Lirali interrupted sharply. She would have known if she'd completed her training instead of running off to play at love with creatures of the night. The accusation hit like a physical blow, but Serafina forced herself to remain standing. Around them, the temperature continued to drop, and she could feel the castle itself responding to the supernatural tension. Ancient stones groaning, windows rattling in their frames, the very air humming with barely contained power. "So what now?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You take me away, train me properly, and then what? I become your weapon, your tool for whatever wars you mentioned." Lirali's smile was sharp as winter starlight. "Now you choose, granddaughter. Come with us willingly and learn to wield your birthright with wisdom, or remain here and watch everything you touch crumble to ash." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword about to fall. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword about to fall, and Serafina felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. The choice before her wasn't simply between power and powerlessness. It was between accepting the brutal wisdom of her bloodline and clinging to the impossible hope that love might yet triumph over the darkness she had helped create. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would offer little comfort. "Until dawn," Lirali replied, her golden flames flickering with impatience. "The barriers between worlds grow thin tonight, and we cannot maintain our presence here much longer without drawing unwanted attention." Valerian's sharp intake of breath drew Serafina's gaze. His face had gone ashen, and she could see terror flickering behind his carefully controlled expression. "What unwanted attention?" Serafina demanded. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, lowering her hood to reveal a face marked by ritual scars that gleamed silver in the supernatural light. "The curse you created has not gone unnoticed by the Elder Darkness, child. There are entities that feed on such prolonged suffering, ancient things that grow fat on despair. They have been observing." The temperature plummeted another degree, and frost began creeping across the stone floor in spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. Serafina felt something vast and hungry brush against the edges of her consciousness, a presence so alien and malevolent that her awakening power recoiled instinctively. "They're here," Valerian whispered, moving protectively closer to her. "In the walls, in the shadows between spaces. They've been waiting for this moment." Serafina's mind raced as fragments of recovered knowledge clicked into place. The castle's oppressive atmosphere, the way shadows seemed to move independently, the creeping sense of wrongness that had plagued her since her first night here. It hadn't been Valerian's influence at all. Something else had been feeding on the psychic wound she'd torn in reality 8 centuries ago. "The servants," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. They didn't go mad from Valerian's compulsion. Something else was driving them insane. "The Devourers," Lirali confirmed grimly. "Parasitic entities that attach themselves to sources of supernatural trauma. Your curse has been a feast for them, growing stronger with each life lost, each moment of anguish. They won't let you simply walk away, not when you represent the key to perpetuating their feeding ground." As if summoned by her words, the shadows in the room deepened unnaturally. The very air grew thick and cloying, carrying whispers in languages that predated human speech. Serafina felt tendrils of alien consciousness probing at her mind, seeking entry through the cracks in her mental defenses. "We need to prepare," she said, power beginning to flow through her in earnest now. The silver in her bloodline sang a harmony with the iron that had always called to her, and she finally understood why metal had always felt alive beneath her touch. "Whatever choice I make, they won't let it happen unopposed." Valerian nodded grimly, his own supernatural abilities manifesting as frost spread outward from his feet. "The castle's defenses are old, but they might hold long enough." "The castle is compromised," the scarred witch interrupted. 800 years of feeding has given them perches here. We need to move to sanctified ground." "There is no sanctified ground," Valerian said with bitter certainty. Not for something like me. The moment I step onto consecrated earth, you'll burn, Lirali finished. Which is why our granddaughter must choose now, not at dawn. Stay and face the devourers with a cursed monster at your side, or come with us to ground where we can properly prepare you for what's coming. The shadows pressed closer, and Seraphina could hear something moving in the walls, a wet, sliding sound that made her skin crawl. The entity brushing against her consciousness grew bolder, and she caught fleeting images of what it offered: power beyond imagining, dominion over life and death, the ability to reshape reality according to her will. All it wanted in return was to feed on the suffering her enhanced abilities could create. "No," she said aloud, throwing up mental barriers that blazed with silver fire. "I won't be your instrument either." The presence recoiled with something like surprise, then pressed back with redoubled force. Tendrils of darkness began seeping through cracks in the stone, reaching toward her with hungry intent. Valerian stepped between them, his own power flaring crimson against the encroaching void. "Whatever you decide," he said without looking back at her, "decide quickly. They're growing stronger." Seraphina looked from him to her grandmother, from the monster she had cursed to the bloodline that had shaped her destiny, and felt the weight of 8 centuries of consequences pressing down upon her. The approach of dawn meant more than just a deadline. It meant the culmination of everything that had begun with a young witch's desperate attempt to save the man she loved. Time was running out, and the darkness was hungry. But for the first time since remembering who she truly was, Seraphina smiled. "The ordeal begins." Seraphina's smile was not one of joy, but of terrible recognition, the expression of someone finally understanding the true scope of the game being played around them. The devourers pressing against reality, her grandmother's ultimatum, Valerian's tortured existence, even her own awakening power, all of it was connected by threads she was only now beginning to see. "You're all wrong," she said, her voice carrying a resonance that made the ancient stones tremble. "Every single one of you." The tendrils of shadow recoiled slightly, and even Lirali's golden flames flickered with uncertainty. Seraphina stepped away from both Valerian's protection and her grandmother's expectant circle, moving to the center of the room where the supernatural forces converged like opposing tides. "The curse wasn't a mistake," she continued, memory flooding back with crystalline clarity. "It was the only solution I could see to an impossible problem. But I was 17 and terrified, and I didn't understand what I was really doing." "Seraphina," Lirali began, but her granddaughter cut her off with a gesture that sent silver fire crackling through the air. "I bound his soul to mine, yes, but not to torture him, to save him from something worse." She turned to face Valerian, and in her eyes he saw not the broken girl who had cursed him, but the powerful woman she had been before fear and desperation drove her to desperate measures. The devourers weren't drawn here by the curse, were they? They were here first. Valerian's face went white with understanding. "The plague," he whispered, "the madness that was consuming my people, driving them to acts of unspeakable violence. It wasn't a disease at all. It was an infestation," Seraphina confirmed, and suddenly the wet sliding sounds in the walls grew agitated, angry. "The devourers were using your territory as a feeding ground, driving humans and vampires alike to greater and greater acts of cruelty to sustain themselves. You were fighting it, trying to protect what remained of your humanity, but you were losing." The scarred witch stepped forward, her silver scars gleaming brighter. "That's impossible. No 17-year-old witch could perceive." "No trained 17-year-old witch," Lirali corrected quietly, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked uncertain. But Seraphina was never properly trained. Her power developed along unconventional lines. The temperature dropped further, and now ice covered every surface in the room. Seraphina could feel the devourers pressing closer, drawn by the emotional intensity of revelation and memory. They whispered promises in her mind: power to reshape the world, freedom from the burdens of choice, an end to the suffering that had defined 8 centuries. "The curse was meant to cut you off from them," she continued, speaking directly to Valerian now, to create a barrier they couldn't cross, even if it meant trapping us both in an endless cycle of pain. Better that than letting them use you as a gateway into the mortal world. But it didn't work, Valerian said with bitter understanding. The suffering itself became their sustenance. Every servant driven mad, every life I took in my search for answers, it all fed them. Because I was a child playing with forces I didn't understand, Seraphina admitted, silver flames beginning to dance around her form. I created a wound in reality instead of a wall, and now they're so deeply entrenched here that removing them might require... The shadows exploded outward, and suddenly the room was full of writhing darkness. The Devourers had grown tired of patient observation. The revelation of their presence had triggered a more direct response. Tendrils of pure malevolence lashed out, seeking to wrap themselves around Seraphina's awakening power and claim it for their own. Lirali's golden fire blazed higher, and the other witches threw back their hoods to reveal faces marked with protective sigils. Their combined power created a barrier of light, but Seraphina could see it buckling under the assault. "We cannot hold them long," Lirali shouted over the sound of reality tearing. "If you're going to act, do it now." Valerian moved to Seraphina's side, his crimson aura joining with her silver flames. "Whatever you need," he said simply. "Whatever it costs." The Devourers pressed closer, their alien consciousness hammering against her mental defenses. She could feel them offering her everything, the power to end this struggle instantly, to reshape the curse into something that served her will alone, to become the goddess of a new order built on carefully orchestrated suffering. But Seraphina had learned something in her years as Mira that she hadn't known as a young witch drunk on her own abilities. Sometimes the greatest power lay not in what you could take, but in what you chose to give up. She reached for Valerian's hand with her left and extended her right toward Lirale. "Together," she said, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over a long nightmare. "The curse can't be broken from outside. It has to be dissolved from within. But that means we all have to be willing to let go of what we think we want." The ordeal was beginning in earnest now. The moment their hands connected, everything went catastrophically wrong. Instead of the controlled dissolution Seraphina had envisioned, the joining of their powers created a resonance that tore through the magical barriers like lightning through tissue. The witch's protective circle shattered, sending golden flames scattering across the ice-covered stones. Lirali screamed as the backlash threw her against the far wall, her body crumpling with a sound that made Seraphina's heart stop. The Devourers surged forward with triumphant hunger, no longer held back by the failing defenses. But worse than their advance was what Seraphina felt flowing through the connection she had forged. Not the clean joining of complementary powers she had expected, but a torrent of corrupted energy that burned like acid through her veins. "It's not working," Valerian gasped, his grip on her hand tightening even as his own power began to buckle under the strain. "The curse, it's too deeply rooted. 800 years." The sentence cut off as darkness slammed into him, lifting his body and hurling it across the room with bone-crushing force. He struck the stone wall with a wet impact that echoed through the chamber, then slid to the floor and lay still, too still. "Valerian!" Seraphina's scream tore from her throat, but she couldn't reach him. The Devourers had formed a writhing wall between them, their alien forms blocking her path. She could see his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, could see the dark stains spreading beneath his head, but the distance might as well have been an ocean. "Granddaughter." Lirali's voice was weak, distorted by pain, and the blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "You must... The binding is corrupted. We underestimated how deeply they've influenced everything here." Seraphina tried to pull back her power, to sever the connections she had forged, but discovered with growing horror that she couldn't. The curse had wrapped around her magical essence like barbed wire, using her own strength to bind her more tightly. Every attempt to withdraw only drove the thorns deeper. "I can't let go," she whispered, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. "It won't let me." The Devourers pressed closer, their whispers becoming a roar that filled her mind with promises of power built on the ashes of everything she cared about. She could feel her sense of self beginning to fray under their assault, could feel the boundaries between Seraphina and Mira blurring as the curse fed on her confusion. "Take what is offered," they crooned. "Become what you were meant to be. Rule through pain. Grow strong through suffering." One of the remaining witches, the scarred woman, made a desperate lunge toward where Valerian lay motionless, but a tendril of shadow caught her mid-leap and slammed her down onto the stone floor. The crack of breaking ribs was audible even over the supernatural storm, and she didn't get up again. "Too strong," Lirali managed to say, struggling to push herself upright against the wall. "They've been feeding here too long. We cannot match them on ground they've claimed." The silver fire around Seraphina began to dim as more of her power was drawn into the corrupted matrix of the curse. She could feel 8 centuries of accumulated suffering pressing down on her consciousness, every servant driven mad, every life lost, every moment of Valerian's tortured existence feeding back through the connection she had opened. "This is what you wanted to avoid," she realized, the words coming out broken and strange. "This is why you wanted to take me away before I tried to break the curse myself." Lirali's golden flames flickered weakly around her battered form. "The bloodline of the first moon was never meant to break curses, child. We were meant to forge them. Your power, it cannot unmake what it has made. It can only transform it." The implications hit like a physical blow. If she couldn't break the curse, if her very nature prevented the kind of dissolution she had attempted, then everything she had tried to accomplish was not just doomed, it was making things actively worse. "Then Valerian will never be free," she whispered, watching his still form through the wall of hungry shadows. "The servants will keep dying. The devourers will keep feeding. Unless," one of them whispered directly into her mind, "you accept our gift. Rule as we rule, transform the curse into an empire of exquisite suffering." Seraphina felt tears freezing on her cheeks as her strength continued to ebb. The connection she had forged was draining her faster now, pulling her deeper into the web of corrupted magic that held this place together. Soon, she realized, there would be nothing left of either Seraphina or Mira, only another tool for the devourers to use. The last of the protective barriers fell with a sound like breaking glass, and darkness rushed in to claim its prize. In the sudden silence that followed, Seraphina could hear nothing but her own ragged breathing and the wet sounds of the devourers moving closer through dimensions that human minds weren't meant to perceive. All was lost. But in that moment of absolute despair, when the darkness pressed so close that Seraphina could taste its alien hunger on her tongue, she heard something that changed everything, the sound of her own heartbeat. Not the rapid, terrified rhythm she expected, but something else entirely, a steady, powerful pulse that seemed to echo from deeper than flesh and bone. And within that rhythm she heard an echo, another heartbeat, faint but unmistakable, synchronized perfectly with her own. Valerian's heartbeat. Her eyes snapped open, cutting through the writhing shadows to where his motionless form lay crumpled against the stone. He appeared unconscious, possibly dying, but his heart was beating in perfect time with hers. Not just similar timing, the exact same rhythm, as if they shared a single pulse between two bodies. "Impossible," she breathed. But even as she spoke, understanding crashed over her like a tide. The curse hadn't just bound his soul to hers for 8 centuries. It had synchronized their very life forces, creating a connection so fundamental that they had become 2 halves of a single magical entity. That's why her power couldn't unmake what she had wrought, because destroying the curse would mean destroying herself, and her magic would never allow such annihilation. But if they were truly 2 parts of one whole, "I've been trying to break the wrong thing," Seraphina whispered, and suddenly the silver fire around her blazed with renewed intensity. The devourers recoiled, their whispers turning sharp with concern. She had been approaching the curse as if it were chains to be shattered, a prison to be unlocked. But what if it wasn't a prison at all? What if it was a cocoon? The revelation hit her with such force that the ice covering the chamber began to crack and steam. She wasn't meant to break the curse, she was meant to complete it. 800 years of suffering hadn't been punishment, it had been gestation. The slow, agonizing transformation of two separate beings into something entirely new. "The bloodline of the first moon forges curses," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself tremble. "But every forge needs fuel for the fire." Serafina reached deeper into the connection she had opened, but this time she didn't try to sever it or control it. Instead, she embraced it completely, pouring not just her power but her very essence into the bond that linked her to Valerian. She felt his consciousness stir in response, felt 8 centuries of carefully maintained barriers dissolving between them. "Serafina?" His voice echoed in her mind, weak but growing stronger. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 800 years ago," she replied. "Trusting you completely." The Devourers sensed what was happening and attacked with desperate fury, throwing everything they had accumulated against the pair. But their assault only fed more power into the transformation Serafina had initiated. Each tendril of alien darkness that touched them was purified by the silver fire now blazing from both their forms, converted from parasitic hunger into raw creative force. She felt Valerian's memories flooding through their connection, not just the centuries of torment, but the man he had been before, the gentleness he had fought to preserve even as madness pressed in from all sides. She felt his love for her, a constant flame that had burned unchanged through 800 years of separation and pain, and he felt hers in return. The curse began to reshape itself around this new understanding, its fundamental nature shifting from binding to fusion. Serafina felt her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her individual self, felt Valerian's essence intertwining with hers in ways that transcended anything as simple as two people becoming one. They were becoming something that had never existed before, a being of pure will forged from love and tempered by suffering, as comfortable with creation as destruction, capable of standing against entities like the Devourers as an equal rather than prey. "No," the alien voices shrieked as their feeding ground began dissolving around them. "You cannot unmake what has been given. We have claimed this place." "You claimed parasites," Serafina replied, her voice now perfectly harmonized with Valerian's. "But parasites die when their host evolves beyond their reach." The castle itself began to change, stones reshaping themselves as 8 centuries of accumulated suffering transformed into something clean and purposeful. The very air grew lighter as the Devourers found themselves suddenly starved, their food source not destroyed but elevated beyond their ability to consume. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Serafina understood that the frightened 17-year-old witch had been wiser than she knew. Sometimes salvation required sacrifice. Sometimes the only way to save what you loved was to transform it so completely that it could never again be threatened by the forces that had endangered it. The ordeal was ending, but what emerged from its crucible would be something neither entirely human nor vampire, something new, powerful, and finally, completely free. The transformation completed itself in absolute silence. Where moments before two separate beings had struggled against forces beyond their comprehension, now something unprecedented drew its first breath. Serafina felt her consciousness expand and settle into new configurations, still herself, yet infinitely more. Beside her, Valerian's form solidified from silver fire, his features sharper than before, marked with the same luminous scars that now traced her skin in patterns of ancient power. They were no longer bound by the curse. They were the curse, transformed into its ultimate expression, a union that had required 8 centuries to forge properly. "The Devourers," Valerian said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the reformed stones sing in response. "Where?" "Gone," Serafina replied, though she retained perfect awareness of their retreat into dimensions where they would lick their wounds and plan new strategies, but not destroyed. We've removed their food source here, nothing more. She helped Lirale to her feet, marveling at how easily her grandmother's injuries responded to her touch. The silver fire that had nearly consumed her during the transformation now flowed with surgical precision, mending broken bones and internal bleeding with the casual ease of breathing. "Child," Lirale whispered, studying Serafina's transformed features with wonder and no small amount of apprehension. "What have you become?" "Something the world needs," Serafina answered, though she wasn't entirely certain what that meant yet. The knowledge was there, vast and intricate, but she would need time to fully comprehend the scope of what she could now accomplish. The bloodline of the first moon was never meant to just forge curses, was it? We were meant to evolve them. The scarred witch groaned as consciousness returned, her ribs already healing under Serafina's influence. Around the chamber, the other survivors began stirring, their wounds closing as the transformed power washed over them in waves of restoration. "The balance has shifted," Lirale said slowly, golden flames dancing around her fingers as she tested her renewed strength. The Devourers held dominion here through accumulated suffering. But suffering transformed into wisdom. She looked between Serafina and Valerian with growing understanding. That creates something they cannot touch. Valerian moved to one of the great windows, now free of ice, and gazed out at the mountain landscape beyond. "I can feel it," he said quietly. "Every place they've touched, every corner of darkness they've claimed. It's like a map written in shadow." Serafina joined him, her awareness expanding beyond the castle walls to encompass the network of corruption the Devourers had spread across the region. Villages where mysterious plagues of violence had taken hold, forests where travelers disappeared without explanation, ancient ruins that had become focal points for inexplicable cruelty. 8 centuries of preparation, she realized. They weren't just feeding here, they were building something, creating a foundation for a larger invasion. "Then our work is far from finished," Valerian observed. His hand found hers, and the contact sent new insights flowing between them. They could sense each other's thoughts now, share memories and knowledge as easily as breathing. The isolation that had defined both their existences was over. Lirale approached them, her expression thoughtful. "The Coven will need to know what has transpired here. There will be those who fear what you've become, who will see threat rather than opportunity. And they wouldn't be wrong," Serafina admitted. The power flowing through her could reshape reality itself, given sufficient focus. In the wrong hands, or driven by the wrong intentions, it could become something far more dangerous than what the Devourers had attempted. "But that's why there are 2 of us. Balance." She felt Valerian's agreement through their bond. His centuries of fighting to maintain his humanity despite impossible circumstances had taught him restraint she might lack. Her magical knowledge filled gaps in his understanding of the forces they now faced. Together they formed something greater than the sum of their parts. "The servants," Valerian said suddenly, concern sharpening his voice. "The ones who are still alive," Serafina finished, already extending her awareness toward the lower levels of the castle, frightened but unharmed. The curse breaking itself freed them from the compulsions that kept them here. She could feel their confusion, their struggle to understand what had happened to them in the dungeons and servant quarters. Some had been here for months, others only weeks, all trapped in the same cycle that had claimed so many before them. "We'll need to help them remember," she said. "Guide them back to themselves before we can send them safely home." "And then?" Lirale asked. Serafina looked out at the network of shadow she could now perceive spreading across the land like infection through a body. The Devourers had been building toward something for centuries, using places like this castle as staging grounds for a much larger assault on reality itself. "Then we hunt," she said simply. "Every nest, every foothold they've established, we cleanse them all." The ordeal was over, but their true purpose was just beginning. The morning light revealed the true scope of their undertaking. Serafina moved through the castle's lower levels with careful precision, her transformed senses mapping each servant's condition as she approached. The dungeons and quarters that had once echoed with despair now hummed with possibility, but the people trapped within carried scars that would require delicate healing. She found the first group huddled in what had been a storage chamber, 7 individuals ranging from barely 20 to middle-aged, their eyes vacant with the peculiar emptiness of broken compulsion. They looked at her without recognition, though she could feel the fragments of their true selves stirring beneath layers of magical suppression. "Your name is Thomas," she said to the nearest man, placing her palm against his forehead. Silver light flowed between them, not forcing memories to return but creating space for them to resurface naturally. "You came here from Brasov 3 months ago, looking for work to support your sister's family." His eyes flickered, confusion giving way to dawning awareness. Yes, there was a job. But why did I—" Horror crept across his features as disconnected memories began reassembling themselves. "What happened to us? You were not yourselves," Serafina said gently. "But you survived. That matters more than you know." She worked her way through each person methodically, helping them reclaim their identities while carefully obscuring the worst of what they had witnessed. Some had been made to participate in the castle's dark rituals, others had simply endured. All carried trauma that would need time to heal properly. By afternoon, Valerian had organized transportation to return the survivors to their homes. His centuries of managing estates served him well. He knew which villages would ask no questions about unexplained absences, which families would welcome back their lost members without demanding explanations that couldn't be safely given. 37 people, he reported, as the last cart disappeared down the mountain path. "More than I expected to find alive." "Your predecessor was more restrained in his final months," Lirali observed from where she stood examining the castle's transformed architecture. The Devourer's influence was making him sloppy. They were impatient to complete their preparations. Serafina felt a chill of understanding. The creature that had worn Valerian's face for the past year hadn't been acting randomly. Every servant captured, every life taken, had been part of a calculated effort to accumulate enough suffering to power something much larger than a simple feeding ground. "Show me what you saw," she said, extending her consciousness toward Valerian. Through their bond, she experienced his fragmented memories of the possession, glimpses of alien intelligence using his form to conduct rituals he barely comprehended, conversations in languages that predated human civilization, maps drawn in blood showing locations across 3 countries. The Devourers hadn't just been establishing a single stronghold. They had been creating a network of synchronized feeding points, each one timed to activate when their invasion began in earnest. The castle had been intended as a control node, its accumulated power used to coordinate attacks on multiple dimensional barriers simultaneously. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Until the Feast of Shadows," Valerian replied, accessing knowledge his possessor had retained. 2 months. They were so close to completion that stopping them here has only delayed their timeline, not disrupted it entirely. Serafina moved to the great map table that had appeared in what was once the castle's war room, another manifestation of their transformation. The ancient wood showed a perfect representation of the region's mystical geography, ley lines, places of power, and, most importantly, the dark stains where Devourer influence had taken root. 17 primary sites, she murmured, tracing connections with her finger, each one feeding power to the others through underground networks. If they complete even half the necessary rituals, the barriers between dimensions will weaken enough for a full invasion, Lirale finished grimly. "They've been planning this for millennia, child. What we stopped here was merely the final phase of preparations that began before recorded history." The weight of responsibility settled over Serafina like a mantle. She had sought only to free the man she loved, but fate had transformed her into something far more significant, a guardian against forces that threatened reality itself. "We can't face them all directly," she realized. "Even with our combined power, 17 strongholds simultaneously would overwhelm us." Valerian studied the map with tactical precision, his noble education finally serving its intended purpose. Then we don't attack them. We turn their own network against them. He traced a pattern connecting the various sites, showing how each one relied on the others for stability. If we can corrupt the network's central coordination points, here, here, and here, their synchronized timing will collapse. Instead of a coordinated invasion, we'll have 17 separate incidents we can handle individually. Sabotage, Serafina breathed, seeing the elegant simplicity of it. Make them fight us on our terms instead of theirs. The plan would require them to infiltrate the 3 most heavily defended Devourer strongholds, deep in territories where their enemies had held sway for centuries. It would mean leaving behind the safety of their transformed castle to venture into realms where they would be vastly outnumbered. But as Serafina felt Valerian's absolute confidence flowing through their bond, she knew they had no choice. The final confrontation was coming whether they sought it or not. Better to meet it as hunters than as prey. The first stronghold lay beneath the ruins of an ancient monastery in the Carpathian depths, where reality had grown thin enough that shadows moved independently of their sources. Serafina and Valerian approached through a forest that whispered in languages predating human speech, their transformed senses picking up distortions that would have driven ordinary minds to madness. 300 Devourers minimum, Valerian murmured, his consciousness mapping the alien presence below. They've had centuries to establish themselves here. Then we give them something they won't expect, Serafina replied, drawing upon every lesson Lirali had taught her about manipulating dimensional barriers. We don't try to match their numbers, we change the rules entirely. She pressed her palms against the monastery's crumbling foundation stones, feeling the corruption that had seeped into the very rock over decades of devourer occupation. Where once she would have tried to cleanse or destroy it, now she understood a subtler approach. The curse that had transformed her operated through evolution rather than elimination. She would apply the same principle here. Silver fire flowed from her touch into the ancient stone, but instead of burning away the darkness, it began transforming it. The alien hunger that had fed on suffering for so long found itself suddenly starved as its food source elevated beyond its ability to consume. The sensation was like watching parasites attempt to feed on pure light. Through the network connection, she felt devourer strongholds across the region shudder as their carefully maintained balance began to shift. The creatures below erupted from their hidden chambers in fury, their forms barely visible as they existed partially outside normal space. Valerian met their assault with surgical precision, his noble training transformed by centuries of fighting to maintain his humanity against impossible odds. Where they came at him as a swarm, he moved like a blade, cutting through their numbers not through superior strength, but through perfect understanding of their weaknesses. They can't maintain coherent form in transformed space, he called out, driving 3 entities back into the dimensional gaps they had emerged from. Your modifications are making this realm uninhabitable for them. Serafina pressed deeper into the foundation, following corruption down to its source. In the monastery's deepest chambers, she found what the Devourers had been building, a massive array of crystallized suffering, each formation containing the anguish of thousands of victims accumulated over centuries. The sight would have broken her heart if she hadn't already learned to transform pain into purpose. All those people, she whispered, feeling the echo of their final moments preserved in the alien machinery. They're still here, still trapped. Can you free them? Valerian asked, appearing at her side as the last of the defensive swarm retreated to safer dimensions. Better than that, Serafina replied, understanding flooding through her as she saw how the Devourer's own network could be turned against them. I can give them what they've been waiting centuries for, the chance to strike back. She opened herself completely to the crystallized suffering, but instead of trying to absorb or destroy it, she offered it something it had never been given, the choice to transform. 800 years of her own pain had taught her that anguish held in stasis was just another form of imprisonment, but anguish accepted and evolved became wisdom, became strength, became the power to prevent others from experiencing the same fate. The crystals began to resonate, their trapped victims finally understanding that their long captivity was ending not in oblivion but in purpose. Through the network connection, every devourer stronghold simultaneously felt the shift as their primary food source became their greatest threat. "The second sight," Valerian said urgently as they felt the network's coordination protocols beginning to collapse. "They'll be trying to isolate the damage." They emerged from the monastery ruins to find reality itself celebrating their victory. Colors seemed more vivid. The forest's whispers had become actual songs, and the oppressive weight that had hung over this place for centuries was lifting like fog before sunrise. But there was no time to appreciate their success. Through their enhanced awareness, they could feel devourer forces throughout the region mobilizing in desperate response. The creatures had spent millennia building their invasion network, and they wouldn't allow it to be dismantled without a fight that would shake the foundations of multiple dimensions. The second stronghold was already preparing its defenses as Serafina and Valerian raced through terrain that shifted between normal forest and alien landscape with each step. Here they would face not just devourers, but the human cultists who had allied with them, the corrupted spirits they had enslaved, and guardians that had been waiting centuries for exactly this confrontation. Everything Serafina had learned about transformation, everything Valerian had discovered about maintaining hope in hopeless circumstances, every lesson their 8th-century ordeal had taught them, all of it was about to be tested against enemies who had been preparing for this battle since before the Roman Empire fell. The final test had truly begun, and failure would mean not just their own destruction, but the collapse of barriers that had protected reality itself for millennia. The confrontation. The second stronghold erupted from the earth as they approached, no longer content to hide beneath ancient ruins. What had once been a forgotten Gothic cathedral now twisted skyward in impossible geometries, its spires reaching into dimensions that hurt to perceive directly. The air itself screamed with the sound of reality being forcibly reshaped. "They're panicking," Serafina observed, feeling the chaotic energy radiating from the transformed structure, pulling power from their other sites to reinforce this one. "Good," Valerian replied grimly. "Let them weaken their network further." But as they drew closer, the true scope of their opposition became clear. This wasn't just another feeding ground, it was a fortress. Centuries of accumulated darkness had been weaponized into defensive systems that existed across multiple planes simultaneously. Human cultists in blood-stained robes chanted from floating platforms that defied gravity, while corrupted spirits howled through the air like living storm fronts. And descending from the cathedral's highest spire came something that made even the devourers seem manageable by comparison, a figure in tattered nobility's garb, its face bearing features that were almost familiar. "Impossible," Valerian breathed, his certainty wavering for the first time since their transformation. "That's another you," Serafina finished, her enhanced senses parsing the truth of what they faced. Not just another victim of devourer possession, but a willing collaborator. A version of Valerian who had chosen to embrace the darkness instead of fighting it. From one of the other timelines. The entity that had once been a Count Draculesti in some parallel reality landed before them with predatory grace, its smile revealing fangs stained with centuries of willing cruelty. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of dimensions where hope had died completely. "How touching," it said, its gaze moving between them with amused contempt. "The little blacksmith's daughter actually managed to save her monster. But you're too late to stop what's coming, and far too naive to understand the true scope of your failure." Serafina felt Valerian's shock through their bond, not just at seeing what he might have become, but at recognizing the implications. If the devourers could access alternate versions of people across dimensional barriers, their invasion had already succeeded in parallel realities. "How many?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Countless," the corrupted nobleman replied. In most timelines, your precious Valerian never escaped his curse. In others, you never arrived to save him. The Devourers have been harvesting successful invasion strategies across infinite possibilities. This reality is simply the last to fall. The cathedral began reshaping itself around them as the entity spoke, walls flowing like liquid stone to create an arena where dimensional laws shifted with each heartbeat. Gravity reversed itself randomly, time moved in stuttering loops, and the very air became a weapon that cut like razors when breathed. But Seraphina had learned something in their first victory that the Devourers' multi-dimensional perspective had failed to account for. Their transformation hadn't just given them power, it had made them something genuinely new, not just another iteration of familiar patterns, but an evolution the enemy's calculations couldn't predict. "You're right," she said, silver fire beginning to dance around her fingers. "In most timelines, we fail. But we're not most timelines, are we, Valerian?" Through their bond, she felt his understanding crystallize into absolute determination. Their love hadn't just survived 8 centuries of impossible circumstances, it had been forged by them. They had become something that existed outside the patterns the Devourers could map or manipulate. The corrupted Count attacked first, moving with speed that should have been impossible to counter, but Valerian met him not as an opponent, but as a mirror reflecting what he had refused to become. Every blow exchanged carried the weight of choices made and paths rejected. Where his alternate self had embraced cruelty, Valerian had maintained compassion. Where corruption had offered power, he had chosen responsibility. Meanwhile, Seraphina turned her attention to the cathedral itself, recognizing it as the true threat. The building wasn't just a stronghold, it was a massive ritual focus designed to amplify the network's final assault. Every stone had been soaked in suffering, every archway calibrated to channel dimensional energy with devastating efficiency. But suffering transformed became wisdom, and wisdom applied with purpose became unstoppable. She pressed her consciousness into the cathedral's foundation, following the threads of anguish that powered it back to their sources. Thousands of victims across multiple realities, their pain harvested to fuel this moment of intended triumph. Like the monastery before, she offered them choice, remain trapped as fuel for their enemies or accept transformation and become the instruments of their captors' destruction. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 8 centuries of learning to evolve beyond her own trauma had taught her how to guide others through the same process, but multiplied across dimensional barriers, the effect was exponential. Reality convulsed as the cathedral's power source became its destroyer, and through the network connection, every remaining Devourer stronghold felt the foundations of their invasion collapsing. The final confrontation had only just begun, but already the outcome was becoming clear. The cathedral's collapse sent shockwaves across dimensions, but Seraphina barely noticed. Her consciousness was fragmenting across infinite realities, experiencing the liberation of countless trapped souls simultaneously. Each freed spirit carried part of her essence with it, spreading the transformation beyond anything she had intended or prepared for. Through their bond, she felt Valerian's alarm as her physical form began to flicker like candlelight in wind. "Sarah!" His voice seemed to come from very far away, though he stood mere feet from her. The corrupted Count lay defeated, already dissolving back into whatever timeline had spawned him, but victory felt hollow as Seraphina's presence wavered. She tried to speak, to reassure him, but found her voice scattered across dimensions. Part of her was helping spirits in a reality where Rome never fell. Another fragment was breaking chains in a timeline where the Devourers had conquered openly. The liberation she had offered the cathedral's victims had created a cascade effect she couldn't control or contain. "Too much," she managed to whisper, her form solidifying just enough for words. "There are so many, across all the realities. They're all connected." Lirale's essence stirred within their transformed castle, sending urgent knowledge. Through their bond, the network the Devourers built works both ways, She's following their connections to free every victim across every timeline they've touched. But a mortal consciousness, even transformed, cannot exist in infinite dimensions simultaneously. Valerian understood with horrible clarity Seraphina's act of ultimate compassion. Freeing not just the victims here but everywhere across the multiverse would tear her apart. The scope of her sacrifice was beyond what any single being could survive. "There has to be another way," he said desperately, reaching for her flickering hand. His fingers passed through silver light that felt increasingly insubstantial. "There is," she replied, and for a moment her form stabilized completely, her eyes meeting his with perfect clarity. "But you won't like it." Through their bond, she showed him what she had learned in those scattered moments across infinite realities. The Devourer network wasn't just a tool for invasion, it was a system that could be permanently transformed into something benevolent, a multi-dimensional connection that could carry hope and healing instead of hunger and despair. But only if someone was willing to become its living core, to exist simultaneously across all realities as a guardian against future incursions. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself alone," Valerian said, understanding flooding through him. "If you're going to bind yourself to this network, then we do it together." "You don't understand," Seraphina said, her form beginning to fragment again as more connections activated. "The curse that created you, it was designed to prevent exactly this kind of transformation. You can't exist across multiple dimensions. Your essence is anchored to this specific timeline. If you try to follow me—" She didn't need to finish. He would be destroyed completely, not scattered, but obliterated. The curse that had trapped him for 8 centuries would also prevent him from joining her in this final transformation. Around them, reality continued to convulse as the Devourer network completed its conversion. Where once it had carried suffering between worlds, now it pulsed with liberation and hope. But the process required a consciousness vast enough to coordinate connections across infinite possibilities, a role that would consume whoever accepted it. 800 years, Valerian said, his voice breaking. 800 years I waited to feel human again, to love again. And now you get to live, Seraphina replied, her smile radiant even as her physical form became increasingly translucent. "Really live, Valerian. The curse will break when I complete the transformation. You'll be free to grow old, to find peace, to become everything you were meant to be before the darkness claimed you." He wanted to rage against the unfairness of it, to demand she find another solution. But through their bond, he could feel the weight of responsibility she carried. Across infinite realities, creatures like the Devourers would always emerge to prey upon suffering. The network she was transforming would be the only permanent defense against such invasions. Will we still be connected?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from her expression. "No," she whispered. "The bond that saved us both will be dissolved when the transformation completes. You'll remember everything, but you'll be free of it, free of me." The cathedral's ruins dissolved completely around them as the conversion reached its final phase. Seraphina's form was now more light than substance, her consciousness stretched across dimensions beyond counting. But her eyes remained fixed on his, pouring 8 centuries of love into these last moments of connection. "Don't mourn what we're losing," she said, as the first threads of their bond began to unravel. "Celebrate what we proved was possible. Love can conquer any monster, Valerian, even the ones that live in ourselves." Her form scattered into starlight as the transformation completed, leaving him alone in a forest that seemed suddenly, achingly ordinary. The weight of the curse lifted from his shoulders like chains finally breaking, but the absence of her presence felt like losing half his soul. Across infinite realities, a new guardian took her eternal watch, ensuring no timeline would face the Devourer's hunger unprepared. Victory had required the ultimate sacrifice, and the cost was everything they had fought to preserve. The silence that followed was unlike anything Valerian had experienced in 8 centuries. not the oppressive quiet of his cursed existence, nor the tense anticipation before battle. This was the hollow echo of absence, of a world suddenly too large and empty for one man to bear alone. He stood motionless in the clearing where the cathedral had been, his newly mortal heart hammering against ribs that no longer housed supernatural strength. The forest around him hummed with ordinary life, birds calling, leaves rustling, insects buzzing through shafts of golden sunlight that seemed almost aggressively normal after witnessing reality tear itself apart and reshape. She's really gone. The thought hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over with grief so pure and human it shocked him. For 800 years, pain had been filtered through supernatural consciousness, distant and manageable. This raw, mortal anguish was something else entirely, immediate, devastating, inescapable. His hands, when he raised them to his face, were warm, trembling with exhaustion and loss, but warm with living blood instead of supernatural chill. The curse that had bound him for centuries had indeed broken with Seraphina's transformation, leaving him exactly what she had promised, free, mortal, human, and utterly, completely alone. "Don't mourn what we're losing," her voice echoed in his memory, though their bond no longer carried her presence. "Celebrate what we proved was possible." But how could he celebrate when the cost had been everything? How could he find joy in his freedom when it had required her sacrifice? The forest around him might be singing with natural beauty, but all he could feel was the phantom ache where their connection had been severed. Valerian forced himself to walk, one foot in front of the other, though he had no destination in mind. His steps took him along the path they had traveled together just hours ago, though it felt like lifetimes had passed since then. Every stone, every tree, every turn in the trail carried memories of her voice, her laugh, her fierce determination to save him despite impossible odds. The sun was setting by the time he reached the edge of the forest, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him painfully of the light Seraphina had become in those final moments. Below him stretched a valley he hadn't seen in decades, dotted with villages whose warm light spoke of families gathering for evening meals, of ordinary lives continuing in blissful ignorance of the cosmic battle that had raged above their heads. This is what she saved, he realized, watching smoke rise from a dozen chimneys. Not just this timeline, but all of them. Every family eating dinner tonight, every child falling asleep safe in their beds. They exist because she was willing to scatter herself across infinity. The thought should have brought comfort, should have made her sacrifice feel meaningful and worthwhile. Instead, it only emphasized the magnitude of what he had lost. She hadn't just saved him, she had saved everyone, everywhere, across all possible realities. And he was the only one who would ever fully understand the price she had paid. A sound made him turn, hand instinctively reaching for a sword he no longer carried with supernatural strength. But it was only a deer, picking its way delicately through the underbrush. The animal looked at him with liquid brown eyes, unafraid, before continuing on its evening journey. Even the wildlife can sense it, Valerian thought with bitter amusement. I'm just another mortal now, no supernatural presence to make them flee. He should have been grateful. 8 centuries of existence as a monster, of being feared and isolated, of watching everyone he might have cared about age and die while he remained trapped in unchanging darkness. It was over. He could grow old now, could form relationships without the spectre of his curse hanging over them, could find peace in ordinary human pleasures. The prospect felt like ashes in his mouth. Night fell as he made his way down into the valley, guided by lights that grew larger and warmer as he approached. The first village was small, perhaps 50 houses clustered around a central square where a fountain bubbled cheerfully. An inn's windows glowed with yellow warmth, and the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread drifted through the evening air. His reflection in the fountain's surface stopped him cold. The face looking back was his own, but transformed. Lines of supernatural cruelty smoothed away, eyes that held weariness instead of ancient hunger, skin that looked merely human instead of marble perfect and coldly beautiful. He appeared to be perhaps 30 years old, though he felt immeasurably older. This is who I would have been, he realized, touching his reflected cheek with wonder and sorrow. If the curse had never taken hold, if I had lived a normal life, this is the man I might have become. Serafina had given him more than freedom. She had given him back himself, restored the humanity he thought lost forever. The gift was magnificent and terrible, precious beyond measure, and weighted with impossible grief. Tomorrow, he supposed, he would have to figure out how to live with it. The inn's common room fell silent when he entered, conversations dying as eyes turned toward the stranger who carried himself like nobility despite his travel-worn clothes. Valerian had forgotten how humans reacted to unfamiliar faces in small villages, the way suspicion and curiosity warred in their expressions. For 8 centuries, mortals had fled from his supernatural presence or fallen under his compulsion. This ordinary wariness felt almost refreshing in its normalcy. "A room for the night," he said to the innkeeper, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and kind eyes. His voice sounded different to his own ears, still deep, but lacking the otherworldly resonance that had once made mortals tremble. "Of course, sir. That'll be 2 coppers." She studied his face with a shrewd assessment of someone who had learned to read travelers' intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because her expression softened. "You look like a man who's been walking a long road." "Longer than you might imagine," he replied, placing coins on the scarred wooden counter. The simple transaction, money exchanged for services, no compulsion or fear required, struck him as almost miraculous. His room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the village square. Valerian sat heavily on the mattress, his newly mortal body aching from the day's journey in ways he had forgotten were possible. Physical exhaustion was another gift from his restored humanity, though, like all such gifts, it came wrapped in memory of what he had lost. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of silver light and gentle hands, of a voice that had seen him at his worst and chosen to love him anyway. He woke before dawn with tears on his cheeks, another long-forgotten human weakness that felt both alien and achingly familiar. The village was already stirring when he ventured downstairs. Farmers heading to their fields, merchants preparing their wares, children playing in the square with the careless joy of those who had never known real darkness. He watched them from the inn's doorway, marveling at how their simple existence seemed to validate everything Serafina had sacrificed to protect. "You're up early," the innkeeper observed, offering him a bowl of porridge and brown bread. "Most travelers sleep later after a hard journey." "Old habits," he said, though the truth was more complex. 8 centuries of supernatural existence had left him uncertain how to navigate mortal rhythms of rest and waking. As he ate, other guests filtered into the common room, a merchant bound for Bucharest, a young couple traveling to their wedding, a priest making rounds between parishes. Their casual chatter washed over him like music, ordinary concerns about weather and trade and family news that formed the backbone of human civilization. The merchant, a talkative man with a grey beard, eventually drew him into conversation. "You're not from around here," he observed with friendly curiosity. "Traveling far?" "I'm returning home," Valerian said, though the words felt strange. Home was a castle that might no longer exist, filled with memories of a woman who now existed across infinite dimensions. "I've been away for a very long time." "Ah, I know that feeling. Travel changes a man, doesn't it? You can never quite go back to being who you were before." The observation hit deeper than the merchant could have intended. Valerian nodded slowly, understanding beginning to crystallize. "No," he agreed quietly. "You can't." But perhaps that was the point. He wasn't the same man who had been cursed 8 centuries ago, consumed by rage and pride and hunger for power. Nor was he the monster that curse had created, feeding on fear and isolation, the man sitting in this ordinary inn, eating ordinary food while listening to ordinary human conversation. This was someone new entirely. Someone shaped by love and loss, by the choice to fight against his nature rather than surrender to it, by the experience of being seen and accepted despite his darkest impulses. Seraphina's influence hadn't vanished with their broken bond. It lived on in the man her faith had helped him become. The wedding couple was discussing their future with bright enthusiasm, making plans for the farm they would build together, the children they hoped to raise. Their innocent optimism might once have filled him with cynical amusement or bitter envy. Now, he found himself genuinely hoping their dreams would flourish. When he finally left the inn, the morning sun painted the village in warm gold that reminded him of Seraphina's smile. The memory brought pain, but also something else, a fierce protectiveness for this ordinary beauty she had died to preserve. These people would never know her name or understand her sacrifice, but they were living proof that it had mattered. The road stretched ahead, winding through valleys toward distant mountains that might still hold the ruins of his ancestral home. He had no clear destination, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other, but for the first time since the cathedral's collapse, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than loss. He was no longer a vampire lord or a cursed monster. He was simply a man with human strength and mortal time, walking toward whatever future awaited. As the weeks passed, Valerian found himself settling into rhythms he had never imagined possible. The road had led him not back to his ancestral lands, those ruins held only echoes of what he had been, but to a small coastal town where the salt wind carried stories of distant shores and new beginnings. He had taken work at the harbour, his strong back and steady hands proving valuable for loading merchant ships and mending nets. The irony wasn't lost on him. 8 centuries of supernatural power reduced to honest labour for honest coin. Yet there was a peculiar satisfaction in it, a grounding in the physical world that his cursed existence had never allowed. The other workers had accepted him without question, dubbing him simply Val when his full name proved too formal for dock conversation. They knew nothing of his past and seemed content with his quiet competence and willingness to take the most difficult shifts. For the first time in his existence, he was valued not for fear he inspired or power he wielded, but for the simple reliability of his presence. His lodgings were a modest room above a bakery, where the scent of fresh bread replaced the cold stone smell of his former castle. The baker's widow, Anna, had grown fond of him in the motherly way of women who recognized a lost soul when they saw one. She asked no questions about the sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes, instead pressing extra rolls into his hands with gentle insistence that he was too thin. The seasons turned with a beauty that still caught him by surprise. Summer brought fishing boats heavy with their catch and festivals that filled the streets with music and laughter. Autumn painted the harbour in golds and crimsons that no longer brought only pain when they reminded him of Seraphina's light. Winter arrived with storms that battered the coast, and he found himself helping to secure boats and comfort families whose men were still at sea. It was during one such storm that he met Elena. She had come to the docks searching for word of her brother's fishing vessel, her dark hair whipping in the wind and fear bright in her brown eyes. Without thinking, Valerian had offered his coat and the warmth of the harbour master's office, staying with her through the long night until her brother's boat limped safely home. Their friendship grew slowly, built on shared cups of tea and quiet conversations about books and dreams and the strange ways life could surprise you. Elena worked as a seamstress, her gentle nature and quick wit a balm to wounds that time had softened, but never fully healed. She never asked why a man of his obvious education worked the docks, or why he sometimes stared out at the horizon as if searching for something forever lost. One evening, nearly 2 years after his arrival, they sat on the harbour wall watching the sunset paint the water in shades of copper and rose. Elena had been telling him about her plans to expand her shop, her excitement infectious as she described the dresses she hoped to create. "You should do it," he said, meaning it completely. "You have the talent and the vision. Don't let fear hold you back from what you want to build." She smiled at him, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. "What about you, Val? What do you want to build?" The question hung between them like a bridge he wasn't certain he was ready to cross. For 2 years he had focused on simply existing, on learning to be human without the weight of supernatural hunger or ancient guilt. The idea of actively building something, a life, a future, perhaps even love again, felt both terrifying and achingly possible. "I don't know," he admitted. "I spent so long focused on surviving that I forgot how to truly live." "You're helping me remember." Elena's hand found his, warm and real and wonderfully mortal. "We could remember together," she said quietly, "if you wanted." He thought of Serafina then, not with the devastating grief that had once threatened to drown him, but with gratitude for what she had taught him about the courage required for love. She existed now, across infinite realities, a guardian ensuring that suffering would never go unanswered, that hope would always find a way to flourish. Her sacrifice had meaning precisely because people like Elena could offer their hearts without fear, because ordinary love could bloom in the safety she had died to preserve. "I'd like that," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his restored humanity. As darkness settled over the harbor and the first stars appeared above the gentle waves, Valerian understood that this was what redemption looked like, not a grand gesture or dramatic transformation, but the quiet courage to accept happiness when it was offered, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been lost. He was no longer the monster cursed to eternal hunger, nor the broken man who had loved and lost across dimensions. He was simply Val, a dock worker who had found his way home at last, ready to discover what new stories the future might hold.